can you give me 30 pieces of silver and I will help you arrest Jesus?
Yes, we will give you 30 pieces of silver.
Imagine sitting across from someone you trust
What have I
completely.
done?
Someone who has shared your journey, witnessed your struggles, heard your deepest thoughts, and stood beside you when nobody else did. Now imagine discovering that this same person was secretly planning the moment they would turn against you. Not because they hated you, not because they were a stranger, but because something inside their mind changed. Throughout history, betrayal has always fascinated people because it forces us to ask one uncomfortable question. How can someone who appears loyal suddenly become the person who causes the greatest damage? More than 2,000 years ago, one name became forever connected with this question: Judas Iscariot. He was not an outsider. He was one of the 12 disciples chosen to follow Jesus. He walked with him, listened to his teachings, witnessed miracles, and lived alongside the people who believed they were changing the world. Yet he became remembered as the man who betrayed Jesus. But what was happening inside his mind? Was Judas simply greedy? Was he disappointed? Was he manipulated by circumstances? Or was there a deeper psychological process that transformed a devoted follower into history's most famous betrayer? We have to understand something deeper. What actually happens inside the human mind when loyalty turns into betrayal? If you find this topic fascinating, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay until the end, because we are going to explore the hidden psychology behind one of the most misunderstood figures in history. The story of Judas Iscariot is often told as a simple story of good versus evil, a hero, a villain, a betrayal. But human psychology is rarely that simple. The psychology of betrayal is the study of why people who once showed loyalty, love, or commitment can eventually choose actions that hurt others. Betrayal is not only about the action itself. It is about the emotional journey that happens before the action, the thoughts, the frustrations, the disappointments, the justifications, the internal conversations people have with themselves. When people hear the name Judas, many immediately imagine a cold-hearted person who woke up one day and decided to become evil. But psychology teaches us that human behavior usually develops through a series of small choices, experiences, beliefs, and emotional changes. Understanding Judas is important because his story reflects something universal: the possibility that even strong relationships can be damaged when expectations, emotions, and personal desires begin to conflict. And that raises a powerful question. Could Judas have seen himself as the villain? Or did he believe in some way that he was doing what needed to be done? To understand that, we need to go back to where the story began. Judas lived during a tense and complicated period in history. The region of Judea was under Roman control, and many people were waiting for a leader who would bring change. For many Jews at the time, the idea of a Messiah carried powerful expectations. Some expected a spiritual teacher. Others expected a political figure who would challenge Rome. This historical environment matters because expectations shape human behavior. A person does not only respond to reality, they respond to the reality they believe should exist. Judas became one of Jesus' 12 disciples. According to the biblical accounts, he traveled with Jesus and the other disciples, witnessing teachings and events that shaped their movement. But somewhere along the way, a gap may have developed between what Judas expected and what he experienced. This is where psychology becomes interesting. One possible explanation involves something called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance happens when a person experiences conflict between what they believe and what they see happening. For example, someone may strongly believe they understand a situation, but when reality does not match their expectations, their mind experiences discomfort. The human brain naturally tries to reduce that discomfort. Sometimes people change their beliefs, sometimes they blame others, Sometimes they reinterpret events to make their choices feel justified. In Judas' case, historians and scholars have debated many possible motivations. Some traditions emphasize greed because Judas was described as handling the group's money and accepting 30 pieces of silver. Others suggest disappointment, political expectations, or a desire to force a situation to unfold differently. The truth is that we cannot look directly into Judas's thoughts, but psychology allows us to examine patterns that appear in many human situations. Betrayal often begins long before the moment of betrayal. It begins with internal changes, a growing resentment, a hidden disappointment, a feeling that something is not going the way it should. A person slowly creating a different story in their mind. And that is what makes Judas's story so psychologically powerful. Because betrayal rarely begins with one dramatic decision. It often begins with a quiet shift inside. One of the strongest forces behind betrayal is disappointment. People often betray others when reality fails to match the future they imagined. Think about everyday life. A person joins a company expecting recognition, but years later they feel ignored. A friend expects support, but feels abandoned. A partner expects one kind of relationship, but experiences another. Over time, disappointment can transform into frustration. In Judas' story, some interpretations suggest he may have had expectations about who Jesus was. What would happen next? If those expectations changed, it could have created an emotional conflict. The important lesson is this. Sometimes people do not betray because they stopped caring. Sometimes they betray because their personal story about what should happen has become more important than the relationship itself. One of the most powerful psychological tools humans possess is the ability to explain their own actions. People rarely think, I am doing something wrong because I want to do something wrong. Instead, the mind creates explanations. I had no choice. They deserved it. This is necessary. I am actually helping. This process is called rationalization. It allows people to protect their image of themselves. A person can commit a harmful action while still believing they are a good person. This is one reason betrayal is so complicated. The betrayer may not see themselves as the villain. They may see themselves as someone responding to a situation. The mind searches for a story that makes our choices acceptable. And when that story becomes strong enough, even a person's closest relationships can be damaged. Betrayal is often connected to emotional conflict. A person can experience competing feelings at the same time: love and anger, respect and disappointment, loyalty and selfish desire. Humans are complicated because emotions do not always disappear when new emotions appear. Someone can care about another person and still make a decision that harms them. This internal battle is one reason Judas remains such a fascinating figure. He represents a difficult question. Can someone make a terrible choice while still being deeply human? Psychology suggests the answer is yes. Understanding behavior does not mean excusing it. It means examining the process that leads people toward their decisions. Another major factor behind betrayal is the conflict between personal desire and commitment. Every person carries personal goals: recognition, power, security, control. When personal desires become stronger than loyalty, relationships can become vulnerable. A person may begin asking, "What am I getting from this?" instead of, "What responsibility do I have?" This shift from connection to self-interest can slowly change behavior. And sometimes the person does not notice the transformation happening. Before many betrayals happen, emotional distance often develops. The person begins withdrawing internally. They communicate less. They stop sharing honestly. They create a separate world inside their mind. This emotional separation makes harmful choices easier because the connection that once created loyalty becomes weaker. In Judas' story, the dramatic moment of betrayal was not the beginning. The deeper psychological story may have been the invisible process happening before it. And that leads us to an important question. What happens when betrayal moves from the mind into real life? That is where the consequences become impossible to ignore. The story of Judas Iscariot may have happened thousands of years ago, but the psychology behind betrayal is still present in everyday life. Because betrayal is not only about famous historical moments, it happens in friendships, families, relationships, workplaces, communities, and sometimes the most painful betrayals come from the people we never expected to hurt us. Imagine a friend who slowly stops responding to messages, a family member who begins hiding important information, a co-worker who secretly takes credit for someone else's work. At first, the betrayal itself is not always obvious. Often, the warning signs appear through small changes. Trust begins to weaken, communication breaks down, a person starts creating distance, and eventually, a decision is made that damages the relationship. In relationships, betrayal can destroy the foundation people depend on most, trust. Trust is built slowly through consistency. Someone shows up. Someone keeps promises. Someone proves through actions that they are reliable. But betrayal can break that foundation quickly. The reason betrayal hurts so deeply is because it changes the meaning of past experiences. People begin asking, was anything real? Did this person ever care? How could I not see it? This is why betrayal often creates emotional confusion. The pain is not only about what happened, it is also about losing the version of reality a person believed in. In families, betrayal can create long-lasting wounds because family relationships are often connected to identity and belonging. When trust is damaged between parents, children, siblings, or relatives, the effects can spread through generations. In the workplace, betrayal can affect teamwork and motivation. A workplace depends on cooperation. When people believe others are acting dishonestly, they become more defensive. They stop sharing ideas. They protect themselves instead of working together. And at a larger level, society itself depends on trust. Every day, people trust strangers, leaders, organizations, and systems. When betrayal becomes common, people become suspicious. They become less willing to cooperate. This is why understanding betrayal matters. Because the same psychological patterns that existed thousands of years ago still exist today. The names change, the circumstances change, but the human mind remains surprisingly similar. And what makes Judas' story even more fascinating is that many parts of it challenge what people think they already know. One surprising fact is that Judas was not a random outsider. Many people imagine betrayal coming from an enemy, but history often shows something different. The deepest betrayals frequently come from people who are close. Psychologists explain that betrayal requires access. A stranger usually cannot betray someone in the same way, because betrayal depends on trust first, existing. The closer the relationship, the greater the emotional impact. Another surprising fact is that betrayal is often not caused by hatred. Many people assume someone betrays because they no longer care. But emotions are more complicated. A person can experience loyalty, frustration, disappointment, and selfish desire at the same time. Human beings can hold conflicting feelings. This is one reason betrayal is so difficult to understand. Another unexpected fact is that people often rewrite their own memories after making major decisions. The brain tries to create consistency. If someone makes a choice that conflicts with their previous identity, they may unconsciously adjust their interpretation of events. They may remember certain moments differently. They may focus on certain details and ignore others. This helps explain how ordinary people can sometimes make extraordinary decisions. Another fascinating detail is that the Bible's portrayal of Judas has created centuries of debate. Some people view him simply as a symbol of evil. Others view him as a tragic figure, who represents human weakness, disappointment, and flawed judgment. The fact that people are still discussing his motives thousands of years later shows how powerful the psychological questions surrounding him remain. And perhaps the most surprising fact is this. The story of Judas is not only about one person's failure, it is also about the human ability to justify, ignore, and reshape our own choices. And that brings us to the darker side of betrayal. Because when trust collapses, the consequences can last far beyond the original moment. Betrayal creates damage that goes deeper than the event itself. The first consequence is the loss of trust. Trust is like invisible currency in human relationships. Without it, everything becomes harder, communication becomes uncertain, intentions become questioned, even simple actions can be misunderstood. The second consequence is emotional damage. People who experience betrayal often struggle with questions that have no easy answers. Why did this happen? Could I have prevented it? Did I misunderstand the person? These questions can keep people trapped in the past. Another risk is that betrayal can create a cycle. Someone who has been betrayed may begin expecting betrayal everywhere. They may become suspicious of people who have done nothing wrong. A painful experience can influence future relationships. This is why healing after betrayal is not only about forgetting what happened. It is about learning how to rebuild healthy trust. There is also another danger. People who betray others may damage their own identity. A person may begin creating a gap between who they believe they are and what they have done. The larger that gap becomes, the more difficult it becomes to face the consequences. This is part of what makes Judas's story so tragic. The act of betrayal was only one moment, but the psychological and emotional consequences continued afterward. And this leads to one of the most important questions. If betrayal can develop through the human mind, can the human mind also learn to prevent it? Understanding betrayal is not about learning how to judge people faster. It is about learning how to recognize the emotional patterns that lead people toward destructive choices. The first step is self-awareness. Many harmful decisions begin when people stop examining their own motives. A powerful question to ask yourself is, am I responding to reality? Or am I responding to the story I created about reality? This question forces the mind to slow down, because sometimes our emotions tell us a story that is incomplete. The second step is honest communication. Many betrayals begin in silence. A person feels disappointed, but never expresses it. They feel ignored, but never explain it. They feel frustrated, but allow resentment to grow. Healthy communication creates opportunities to repair problems before they become bigger. The third step is learning emotional regulation. Strong emotions are not automatically bad. Anger, disappointment, and frustration are normal human experiences. The problem comes when emotions become the only decision maker. A person who learns to manage emotions creates space between feeling something, acting on it. That space can change everything. Therapists often encourage people to examine patterns. What situations trigger strong reactions? What beliefs influence decisions? What fears are underneath the behavior? Because sometimes the action people see on the outside is connected to something deeper happening inside. Another important lesson is understanding expectations. Many conflicts happen because people expect others to behave according to a personal script. When reality does not match that script, disappointment appears. Learning to accept people as they are, while still maintaining healthy boundaries, can prevent many relationship problems. And finally, forgiveness and accountability must exist together. Understanding why someone betrayed you does not mean pretending the betrayal never happened. Healing does not require ignoring the truth. It requires accepting the truth without allowing it to control your entire future. The story of Judas raises a powerful psychological lesson. Human beings are capable of making painful choices, But human beings are also capable of reflection, change, and growth. And that is where the story becomes even more interesting. Because Judas was not the only person in history who struggled with fear, disappointment, and impossible choices. Now that we have explored the psychology behind Judas's betrayal, we need to look at another important question. Was Judas simply a person driven by selfishness, or was his story more complicated? Because many people confuse betrayal with another concept, failure. But betrayal and failure are not the same. A person can fail because of weakness. A person can betray because of a decision. Understanding the difference helps us see human behavior more clearly. So now, let's compare two powerful ideas: the psychology of Judas's betrayal versus the psychology of ordinary human failure, because the difference reveals something important about the human mind. Failure often begins with limitation. A person lacks knowledge, makes a mistake, faces a difficult situation. Betrayal usually begins with a relationship or commitment being violated. The difference is intention. Failure does not always involve choosing to hurt someone. Betrayal involves breaking trust. Behavior. A person who fails may feel disappointment or regret. They may think, "I made a mistake." A person who betrays may create explanations to defend their choice. They may think, "I had a reason." The mind responds differently because the emotional conflict is different. Characteristics. Failure is often connected to growth. People fail, learn, adapt, and improve. Betrayal often involves secrecy, hidden motives, or broken expectations. Relationships failure may damage a relationship temporarily. Betrayal can change how someone views the entire relationship. It attacks the foundation of trust. Decision-making failure often comes from poor judgment. Betrayal often comes from a decision where personal motives overpower commitment. Emotional responses failure often produces embarrassment or disappointment. Betrayal often creates deeper emotions: shock, confusion, loss, the feeling that reality itself has changed. And this comparison helps explain why Judas remains such a powerful figure. His story is not remembered simply because someone made a mistake. It is remembered because it represents one of humanity's deepest fears: being hurt by someone you trusted. The story of Judas Iscariot is ancient, but the psychology behind his actions appears throughout human history. Different names, different situations, different time periods, but the same human emotions: the desire for power, the pain of disappointment, the need to justify choices, and the struggle between loyalty and self-interest. One famous example is the relationship between the assassination of Julius Caesar and his close friend Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus was not a distant enemy. He was someone Caesar trusted. The betrayal shocked Rome because it came from someone inside Caesar's own circle. What makes the story psychologically fascinating is that Brutus reportedly believed he was acting for a greater purpose. This shows one of the most important patterns in betrayal psychology. People often do not view themselves as villains. They create a reason that makes their actions feel necessary. Another example appears in modern relationships. Imagine a business partner who secretly makes decisions behind someone's back. The person may tell themselves, "I had to do this because they were holding me back," or "I deserved more." The betrayal does not begin with the action. It begins with the internal argument happening before the action. A person slowly builds a case inside their own mind. This same psychological process appears in many stories and films. In movies, one of the most memorable betrayal patterns is the character who begins with good intentions but slowly becomes controlled by fear, anger, or ambition. A famous example is Star Wars, Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, where Anakin Skywalker moves from a heroic figure toward betrayal because of fear and emotional attachment. Although fictional, the story demonstrates a real psychological idea. People rarely transform overnight. They often move through a series of emotional steps. Fear creates anxiety. Anxiety creates desperation. Desperation can lead people toward choices they once believed they would never make. Another important example comes from everyday life. A friend who betrays another friend may not wake up wanting to destroy the relationship. Instead, they may experience a series of small changes: feeling overlooked, feeling misunderstood, building resentment, creating assumptions. Eventually, the person may make a decision that seems shocking to everyone else, but inside their own mind, they may have been preparing for it for a long time. This is why studying Judas is so powerful. The lesson is not simply, some people betray. The deeper lesson is, the human mind has the ability to create explanations for almost anything. And understanding that can help us recognize problems before they become irreversible. The story of Judas Iscariot has survived for thousands of years because it touches something deeply human. It is not only a story about one man. It is a story about trust, expectations, disappointment, choices, and the complicated psychology behind human behavior. Judas was not simply a name associated with betrayal. He represents a question that every generation continues to ask. How does someone move from loyalty to betrayal? Psychology suggests that betrayal often develops through a combination of emotions, beliefs, personal desires, and justifications. People may slowly change the way they see a situation until a harmful choice begins to feel acceptable. The biggest lesson is not only about Judas, it is about understanding ourselves. Because every person has moments where emotions, expectations, and decisions collide. The goal is not to believe we are incapable of making mistakes. The goal is to become aware of the thoughts and emotions that influence our choices. Because the greatest protection against betrayal begins with understanding the human mind. Now I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think Judas was simply a villain, or do you think his story reveals something deeper about human psychology? What surprised you the most about the psychology of betrayal? Was it the idea that people often justify their own actions, or the idea that betrayal usually begins long before the final decision? Share your thoughts in the comments. These discussions are what make history, psychology, and human behavior so fascinating. And remember, understanding someone's actions does not mean excusing them, it means learning from them. If you enjoyed exploring the hidden psychology behind Judas Iscariot, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories that uncover the minds, decisions, and emotions behind history's most fascinating people. And if you want to continue exploring the psychology of human behavior, watch our next video where we examine another powerful question: why do ordinary people sometimes make extraordinary choices? Thank you for watching. Stay curious and never stop exploring the hidden stories behind the human mind.